Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, gegrüßet, Jesu, gütig, which translates to be greeted, benevolent Jesus. Fairly straightforward chorale. Really not too much to write home about this particular harmonization. There's a little A flat here that's kind of interesting that I'll talk about when we get there, but we're just going to hop right into the analysis. We have two flats in the key signature. We start on G minor, we end on G major. I reckon we're in the key of G minor. This is a case where G minor actually has a 2-flat key signature. It's generally a toss-up between Bach either using 1 flat or 2 flats, depending on how many E flats make their way into the chorale. But because there's a section, actually 2 sections, maybe a fragment and a section, that have C minor as their pitch center, E flat might have more of like a pertinent place in this particular chorale. So we start off on our tonic triad. We then have F sharp, A, D, and A, just D major over F sharp, that's 5-6. We then have G, G, D, and B flat, tonic triad, root position, 9/8 suspension here in the tenor. Very common to see 9/8 suspensions over tonic triads, especially in root position. A little neighboring 7th here as well before we get G minor again, G, G, D, and B flat, a little delayed passing 7th here. We then have E flat, G, G, and C. C minor over E flat, that's 4-6. A is a non-chord tone, F sharp is a non-chord tone, and that actually gives us a chord that we can spell. It's F sharp fully diminished 7th in 3rd inversion, 7-4-2, and we would expect that to resolve to 1-6. Which, we would expect that to resolve to 3-6, which would be B flat over D, but instead of resolving to B flat over D, we get G minor over D, D, B flat, G, and B flat, and really the only difference here is G versus F natural, so maybe a bit of an irregular resolution here, but I think the 4-2 chord resolves in a way that makes sense. It's just sort of 1-6-4 is operating as a sub for 3-6. They're basically the same chord. And I think even more interestingly is the fact that we have the 7-4-2 chord leading as sort of a predominant to the 1-6-4 and the 5. We have D, D, G, and A, this 4-3 suspension over the bass here. It's very common in dominant triads in root position. With C, G, G, and B flat, that's not really an analyzable chord, but we do have like a 1-6-4-5 going on here with this neighbor tone, and G is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. But we have a half cadence of sorts here, the 1-6-4 going to 5 that doesn't resolve to 1 immediately. It'll have to wait to the next phrase, which takes us to the key of B flat at the very beginning. But we do get our resolution to the previous 1-5 progression. G, D, G, and B flat. Tonic triad and root position is also our 6th chord in the key of B flat. We then have A, C, F, and C, which is our 5 chord in 1st inversion, 5-6. F major over A. And then we have B flat major in root position, B flat, F, and D. 9/8 suspension over our tonic again. Very similar to the beginning of our previous phrase. A little neighboring 7th here as well. Before we get B flat, F, and D, no need to reanalyze because it's the same chord. Passing 7th here in the bass as well before we get G, B flat, E flat, and E flat, which is our 4 chord in 1st inversion, 4-6. A little passing tone in the alto before we get E flat, B flat, G, and D. I guess depending on whether you look at this C as the root of the chord or if you look at this E flat as the root of the chord, I think what's happening here is the chord's in root position, but it adds the 7th as well in the form of this D, but I think you could analyze it as a 2-6-5 as well if you wanted to. And then we get F, B flat, F, and C. I think this B flat's a 4-3 suspension over the bass. That resolves on the next beat down to A, and then we cadence on B flat major, B flat, D, F, and B flat. Tonic triad root position. Next phrase continues in the key of B flat, ends in a half cadence this time, so we start off with B flat major, B flat, B flat, F, and D. No need to reanalyze. That takes us to F major over A, C, F, and C, which is 5, 6, our dominant first inversion. And then we get a little bit of an interesting chord progression. We get a 1 chord with a 9/8 suspension over the bass. We have B flat, C, F, and D, so I am going to analyze this as a 1 chord, but in typical Bach fashion, Bach changes the bass by the time we get the resolution, so we have a passing 7th of the bass, and typically these go upwards, but sometimes they go down and present kind of a unique situation for us. Here we have G, B flat, B flat, and D, which would be a 6 chord, G minor. However, if you look at this F as not a passing 7th, but rather the 5th of the chord, you could analyze this as 1/6/4 as well. It's not uncommon for Bach to have taken a chord and turn it into second inversion by stepping down a step and a half. Here from A to F, that major third. But either way, 6 and 1/6/4 are very similar to one another. They have the same bass and they share 2 tones in common, so it's really splitting hairs here whether it's a 6 or a 1/6/4 chord. Either way, I think maybe 6 makes a little bit more sense, because one of the ways that you could analyze this next chord is 2/6/5, E flat, G, B flat, and C. However, I don't think that's exactly what's going on here. I think it's possible that we have a subdivided chord progression here. And actually, you know what, I'm going to walk that back and say that this is a subdivided chord progression here. This is C minor 7 over E flat, and on the end of the beat we have C, which is a chord tone. We have E flat, which is a chord tone, and we have this neighbor tone here going on as well here in the alto, which turns the chord into A diminished over C. So here we have the potential for a 2 going to 7 chord progression. And the only reason why I think the 2 to 7 chord progressions kind of, I guess, I don't want to say valid. That's kind of a too objective of a term. But, too subjective of a term. But typically 2 to 7 chord progressions are rare in Bach, just because it's the combination of predominant and dominant functioning chords that just happens to share the most tones in common, so it doesn't have the same impact or the same weight that other 2 to 5 or 4 to 7 or combinations of those 2 chords have in the grand scheme of the harmonic narrative. So 2 going to 7 is a relatively rare chord progression, and we often see 2 morph into 7 by Bach turning, what would it be, in the key of B flat? It would be changing the G in the C minor chord to an A, so that that whole step motion turns the 2 chord into the 7 chord, and usually 1 chord morphs into the other, rather than a progression occurring where multiple voices are moving. But here we see a bunch of voices moving, and they're still chord tones, but 3 voices moving off the harmonic rhythm feels like a subdivided chord progression if the chord can be spelled. So we do have a 2 to 7 chord progression here. Take it with a grain of salt, because it is a subdivided chord progression, and not all subdivided chord progressions are sort of made equal in comparison to chord progressions that happen purely on the harmonic rhythm. But after our 7/6 chord, we have B flat, D, F, B flat, and B flat. So first inversion, our tonic triad, and B flat is a chord tone, so we don't have to mark it. And then our half cadence ends with another one of these sort of 4/3 suspension cadences going on here, where we have a 5 chord here, F, F, B flat, and C, that resolves down on the next beat, F, F, A, and C. The next phrase takes us to the key of C minor. We have a perfect authentic cadence at the end, and we start off with an F major chord again, F, F, A, and C, which I think is kind of implying a little bit of melodic minor going on here. We have root position 4 chord. It's not a secondary dominant, it is a byproduct of the melodic minor scale. That takes us to G7 over B, B, F, G, and D, which is 5/6/5. And we would expect that to take us to 1, C, E flat, G, and D flat. And I've been writing chords on the next system fully spelled out in my notes, so I don't break the flow with having to count everything across the systems, which is something that I've done in my past videos if you've watched them. So that's our tonic chord in root position. passing tones in the lower voices, and then we get E flat, C, G, and E flat, which is taking our C chord and inverting it. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Passing tone in the bass, and then we get G, B natural, G, and D, which is our 5 chord, G major. Passing 7th in the alto, and then we get A flat, C, E flat, and C, which is A flat major in root position. That's our 6th chord. Passing 7th in the bass, a little anticipation here in the melody before we get F, C, A flat, and D. It's D minor 7 flat 5 over F. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts. That takes us to 5, G, B, G, and D, G major, passing 7th in the alto, and then Bach cadences in C minor, C, G, E flat, and C. Next phrase takes us back to the key of G minor, but we end in the key of B flat, so we have what I've been calling a mid-phrase modulation. It's much more common for Bach to modulate to a key and stay in it until the next phrase or beyond the next phrase, like we have here in our second phrase. Bach modulates to B flat and stays in B flat. Here Bach modulates to C minor, he stays in C minor. It's less common for Bach to modulate to a key and then modulate again later in the phrase, especially in shorter phrases like this, so it's something that I've been keeping track of. So we start off with C minor, C, C, E flat, and G. It's another C minor chord, so we don't have to reanalyze it, but in the key of G minor, it is our 4 chord. Make that G a little bit more G-like. We then have F sharp, C, D, and A, which is our 5 chord in first inversion with the 7th D7 over F sharp. Then we have G minor, G, B flat, D, and B flat. So there's our 4-5-1 progression, which I also think introduces our 6 chord in the key of B flat. We have this passing tone in the alto as well. Takes us to B flat over D, D, B flat, F, and B flat. It's 1-6. And then we get we get C minor 7 over E flat, B flat, G, and C, 2-6-5. And then we get F, A, F, and C, which is our 5 chord in root position. Typically we would expect 2-6-5 to go to 5. Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts, and that takes us to 1. B flat, F, and D, tonic triad, root position. And our last phrase is in the key of G minor, ends in the key of G minor, but we do get a mid-phrase modulation here with this A flat, which I'm going to talk about like I talked about in the beginning of the chorale. So I think we have a direct modulation here. B flat could be a common chord between B flat and G minor, of course. It's just something about F sharp against F natural feels like a separate idea to me. So when there's those cross relationships between chords separated by a phrase, it feels like a separate idea. So I typically mark these as direct modulations, but sometimes they don't feel as direct. It's based on context and the situation. So we start off with F sharp, A, D, and D, which is 5-6, no 7th this time. The 7th comes on the end of the beat, which becomes an anticipation for the next chord, which is G minor, G, B flat, G, and D. This sees a 4-3 suspension over the bass, less common over root position tonic triads, but we do see them from time to time. And that takes us to a really interesting chord here with the A flat. I think this is a C minor chord with a 7-6 suspension over the bass. So this B flat, I think, is really going down towards this G rather than just this A flat here. So I'm going to call this a C minor chord, which is 4 in the key of G minor, and also our tonic in the key of C minor. This A flat here does kind of give us a 6-6 chord as well, but I'm not really going to mark it just because of the fact that it's just one voice. Well, there are 2 voices moving. The alto leaps up to C as well. So maybe there is a 6-6 chord here, A flat over C. I'll mark that just in case. It takes us to B diminished over D anyways. D, F, B natural, and D with this 7-6 suspension in the alto over the bass. That's 7-6, like I just said, and that's going to resolve to C minor. C, G, C, and C. Sorry, E flat, G, C, and C. 1-6, which I also think in turn turns us back into 4-6 in the key of G minor. Just a little brief stint in C minor here. Basically just like one step beyond tonicizing the chord. We have its dominant here, and we have basically two like triads on either side, a 1-7-6-1-6 progression in the key of C minor, which is a very common chord progression that we see not just in the key of C minor, but just in Bach's chorale writing as well. It's a very common progression we see Bach used to traverse 1, 2, and 3 here in the bass in either direction, either in the retrograde or the way we see it here. We also have some non-chord tones in the inner voices here. We have A and F sharp along with E flat and C, which would leave us with F sharp fully diminished 7th over E flat, another 7-4-2 chord. We've seen this earlier in the chorale. We would expect this to resolve to 3-6, but we're seeing it resolve to 1-6-4 again. D, B flat, G, and B flat. We then have C, E flat, G, and A here on the end of the beat, which would be 2-6-5, A minor 7 flat 5 over C. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential contexts, but here I think 2-6-5 is operating as an interruption between the 1-6-4 to 5 progression here, because we see that the voices are moving the way that we would expect them to. G is going to resolve down to F sharp, and B flat's going to resolve down to A. So I think this 2-6-5 is really just an embellishing chord, and it interrupts the direct voice movement from one to the next, which is kind of interesting. Bach has done this quite a few times in his in the chorales that I've encountered so far. So this is a 5-chord D, D, G, and A with the 4-3 suspension. So we have an example here of a interrupted 1-6-4 to 5, and for those I've been using a hashed bracket. And then we have the resolution of the chord here with the F sharp rather than the G. A little delayed passing 7th here in the tenor, and then we cadence on G major with a, looks a bit like a 1 chord there, so I'm going to connect those. Then we have a major tonic triad, as we often see in Bach's minor chorales. He ends with a Picardy third, and I think that just has to do with his relationship with what major chords do as a grammatical device. Like they feel more final than, say, a minor chord. But we do see Bach end chorales with minor chords as well. But that's today's analysis. I think really the big takeaways are the mid-phrase modulations, so G to B flat, G to C, and also this interrupted 1-6-4 progression is kind of interesting as well. And I guess you can make the argument there is a 2-7 progression going on here, which is kind of atypical. We don't see them all that often, as well as the seemingly irregular 4-2 resolutions where the root is not what we would expect, but the bass is still makes sense. So only half the criteria are being satisfied in terms of how Bach typically resolves his 4-2 chords. But other than that, fairly straightforward chorale. I'm going to cap the video off on those thoughts. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon and like the video as well. Thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.